Royal Guard resigns duty after Princess Charlotte is stripped of her title. Before dawn each morning, the palace felt like a living thing that had not yet opened its eyes. Stone halls breathed cool air, lamps hummed softly, and footsteps sounded louder than they should. This was the hour the guard liked best. There were no crowds, no cameras, no loud orders, only routine duty and the quiet promise that the day would unfold as it always had. The guard had served the crown for more than 25 years. His uniform fit him like a second skin, pressed sharp, buttons polished until they caught the light. He had learned long ago that a royal guard did not exist as an individual. He existed as part of a tradition, older than memory, built on discipline and silence. Feelings were folded away neatly, like unused letters, never meant to be opened. He stood at his post as he always did, back straight, eyes forward. From where he was positioned, he could see a section of the inner courtyard and one of the quieter corridors that led to the private family wing. It was not a place tourists saw. It was a place where the royal family moved as people, not symbols, even though they were never fully free of either role. Over the years, he had watched children grow up in those halls. He had seen them pass him when they were barely tall enough to reach the door handle, and later walk with careful confidence, taught early how to behave under watchful eyes. Among them was Princess Charlotte. She was not yet old, but she carried herself with a calm that surprised many. Even as a child, she understood rules better than most adults. She greeted staff politely, remembered names, and asked questions that showed careful thought. The guard noticed these things because his job was to observe without reacting. Still, some details stayed with him. On certain mornings, the princess would walk with her tutor through the corridor near his post. She often wore simple dresses, neat and practical. Sometimes she held a book close to her chest, fingers marking a page. When she passed, she would offer a small nod, never loud or demanding, just respectful. The guard never nodded back. He was not meant to, but he noticed. Many people believed guards were like statues, unable to think or feel. That belief made the job easier for those who relied on silence. In truth, guards saw everything. They noticed changes in tone, shifts in behavior, and small signs of stress that others missed. Over time, patterns formed. In recent weeks, something had changed. It began quietly. A meeting room that was usually empty stayed lit late into the night. Senior officials walked faster, spoke less, and avoided casual talk. Documents were carried with more care than usual. There was no laughter, no relaxed conversation. Even experienced staff seemed unsure. The guard noticed the way orders were delivered. They were still polite, still correct, but shorter. Less explanation, more finality. When someone asked a question, the answer was often delayed or avoided. These were signs of tension, though no one spoke of it directly. Princess Charlotte's routine shifted slightly. Not enough for the public to notice, but enough for someone who watched daily. A walk that used to happen in the morning was moved to later hours. A lesson that took place in one room was reassigned to another. Small changes, but repeated often. One afternoon, the princess passed the guard alone, something that rarely happened. She walked slower than usual, her steps measured. She stopped briefly near a window, looking out into the garden. Her face was thoughtful, not upset, but uncertain. She turned as if she might speak, then hesitated. The guard remained still, eyes forward as trained. After a moment, she continued down the hall. That moment stayed with him longer than it should have. The guard had sworn an oath early in his career. It was not only to protect lives, but to uphold the dignity of the institution. He believed deeply in that oath. It had guided every choice he made. He had missed birthdays, weddings, and quiet evenings because duty came first. He never questioned that sacrifice. But dignity, he believed, was not only about rules, it was also about fairness. As days passed, whispers grew louder, though still carefully controlled. Staff spoke in lowered voices, doors closed more often. Certain names were mentioned less frequently, as if avoiding them could soften something difficult. The guard did not seek information, he never had. But information has a way of finding those who stand still long enough. One evening, while posted near a service corridor, he overheard fragments of a conversation between two officials who assumed they were alone. The words were not clear, but phrases stood out. Procedure, public response, internal alignment. The tone was serious, almost heavy. Then one sentence, spoken quietly but firmly, settled in his mind. This must be handled without emotion. The guard understood then that something important was unfolding. Decisions made in those rooms would shape lives far beyond the walls of the palace. He had seen such moments before. They always began the same way, calm on the surface, pressure beneath. Princess Charlotte continued her routines, though now they felt more controlled. She followed instructions without complaint. She smiled when required. But the guard noticed how she held herself more carefully, as if trying not to take up too much space. One morning, she dropped a paper while walking past. It slipped from her book and landed near the guard's boots. Protocol demanded he remain still. Another staff member quickly stepped forward to retrieve it. Before it was picked up, the guard caught a glimpse of the page. It was a drawing. Simple lines, careful shapes. A crown sat at the top, drawn slightly crooked. Beneath it stood a small figure, hands clasped. The paper was taken away. The moment passed. The guard felt something shift inside him, subtle but real. He reminded himself that feelings had no place in duty. And yet he could not ignore the quiet weight pressing against his thoughts. That night, as he stood in the corridor under soft lights, he reflected on all he had witnessed over the years. He had protected leaders during celebrations and during times of tension. He had stood firm during public joy and private sorrow. He had believed the system, though imperfect, ultimately aimed to preserve stability. Now, for the first time, he wondered what happened when stability came at the cost of silence. He did not yet know what decision had been made. He did not yet know how it would unfold. But he sensed that the palace, for all its strength, was holding its breath. And so was he. As dawn approached once more, the guard adjusted his stance, just as he had thousands of times before. The corridor was quiet again. The routine remained. But beneath the familiar order, something fragile had begun to crack. And the guard, sworn to stand without question, felt the first stirrings of a question he could no longer ignore. The next few days moved forward on the surface as if nothing had changed. Bells rang on time, schedules were followed, and the palace continued to function with its usual precision. Visitors smiled for photographs, staff bowed and stepped aside, and guards stood unmoving at their posts. To the outside world, everything appeared calm and controlled. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt heavier. The guards sensed it most during the quiet moments, when corridors echoed just a little longer and conversations stopped abruptly when someone else approached. People were careful with their words. Even long-serving staff members, who normally spoke freely among themselves, now chose silence over speculation. Meetings increased. Doors that were usually open remained shut. Senior officials arrived early and left late, their faces drawn with focus rather than ease. Papers were passed hand to hand with strict instructions. Nothing was written casually, nothing was left unattended. The guard noticed a new pattern. Certain individuals began appearing more often in the palace, people who were rarely seen unless serious decisions were being discussed. Advisors, legal experts, and protocol officers moved quietly but with purpose. They did not linger. They did not explain. It was clear that something was being prepared. Princess Charlotte's presence within the palace shifted further. Her movements became more restricted, her schedule tighter. Where she once walked freely with tutors or family members, she was now always accompanied. The routes she took changed often, as if someone were deliberately avoiding familiar spaces. One afternoon, the guard was assigned to stand near a lesser-used hallway that connected administrative offices to the private wing. It was not a ceremonial post. It was practical, chosen for control rather than display. From that position, he could hear voices more clearly than usual. Behind one of the closed doors, a discussion unfolded in low tones. The guard did not move or react, but his training allowed him to catch meaning even when words were incomplete. The conversation centered on public perception, long-term planning, and balance within the institution. There was no anger in the voices, no raised volume. Instead, there was a calm firmness that felt more unsettling than emotion. One voice, steady and experienced, spoke about responsibility. Another spoke about precedent. A third mentioned the importance of protecting the institution above all else. Then came a pause. After the pause, a sentence was spoken slowly, carefully chosen. This adjustment will limit future complications. The guard felt a tightness in his chest, though his face did not change. Adjustments were common in royal life. Titles, roles, and responsibilities were often reviewed and reshaped quietly, but adjustments that required such secrecy rarely ended without consequence. Later that evening, word spread among staff that an internal announcement would be made soon. No details were shared. Only that everyone would be expected to follow updated guidance without question. The palace thrived on structure. People were trained from the beginning to accept direction without hesitation. And yet the guard noticed how several staff members exchanged brief glances when the announcement was mentioned. There was concern there, even if no one said it aloud. Princess Charlotte appeared less often in shared spaces. When she did, her expression remained polite and composed, but the ease she once carried seemed muted. She followed instructions carefully, as she always had, but now with an added layer of caution. One morning, as she passed the guard with her tutor, she asked a simple question. "Will my lessons change again?" The tutor paused before answering, choosing words with care. "Some things may be arranged differently for a while." The princess nodded, accepting the response without complaint. But the guard noticed how she pressed her lips together afterward, as if holding back another question. The guard had seen many forms of quiet strength in his career. He had watched adults mask worry behind formality. Seeing a child do the same unsettled him more than he expected. Later that day, an internal briefing was delivered to senior security personnel. The guard attended, standing among others in a formal room where portraits of past leaders lined the walls. The tone was controlled, professional, and precise. They were informed that certain protocols would be updated immediately. Access points would change. Certain movements would require approval, and above all, discretion was essential. No reasons were given. Questions were not invited. As the briefing ended, the guard noticed something unusual. A line had been added to the protocol list, one that referenced address and formal recognition. It was written in neutral language, but its meaning was clear. Something fundamental was being altered. That night, the guard found himself reflecting on earlier moments in his service. He remembered times when decisions were made quickly to protect stability during difficult periods. He had accepted those decisions without hesitation, trusting the wisdom of those above him. This time felt different. It was not urgency driving the change, it was calculation. The next morning, the internal announcement arrived. It was delivered privately to staff members who needed to know, passed from one level to the next. The language was careful and measured, avoiding emotional terms. It described an administrative decision, framed as temporary, designed to support long-term balance within the royal structure. Princess Charlotte's formal designation would be adjusted. There were no dramatic words, no explanations beyond necessity. The message emphasized unity, respect, and adherence to protocol. The guard read the notice once. Then he read it again. He felt no anger, no shock. What he felt instead was a deep, steady unease. Throughout the day, he watched how the news moved through the palace. Staff members absorbed it quietly. Some nodded in acceptance. Others looked unsettled but said nothing. No one openly challenged the decision. That was how things worked. Princess Charlotte herself was not seen in public spaces that day. When she finally appeared in the evening, walking with a senior attendant, her demeanor was calm. She smiled when greeted. She thanked staff politely, but the guard noticed the change immediately. The way she was addressed had shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible to an untrained ear. A word omitted, a tone softened differently, a pause where confidence once sat. The princess did not react outwardly. She had been taught well. But the guard saw her glance briefly toward the attendant, as if confirming she had heard correctly. Later, as she passed the guard's post, their eyes met for the briefest moment. The guard did not move, did not acknowledge her, but something passed between them that required no words. Confusion. That evening, the palace held a small formal gathering, planned weeks in advance. It proceeded as scheduled. Guests spoke of art, charity, and tradition. Music played softly. Cameras captured smiles. Behind the scenes, the guard stood watch as usual. He listened as one official reassured another that the decision would settle quickly and remain internal. He heard confidence in their voices, as if the matter were already closed. But the guard knew better. Decisions made without emotion often leave emotional traces behind. As the gathering ended and guests departed, the guard remained at his post. The corridor was quiet again, but the silence felt heavier than before. Princess Charlotte passed through later, escorted back to her rooms. She walked with her head held high, posture straight, every movement careful and practiced. She did not look at the guard this time. After she disappeared down the hallway, the guard felt the weight of his oath more strongly than ever. He had promised to protect the institution. He had promised loyalty, but loyalty, he was beginning to understand, was not always simple. As night settled over the palace, the guard remained still, just as he always had. Yet inside, questions continued to form, slow and steady. He did not yet know what he would do with them. He only knew that something important had shifted, and once shifted, it could not be easily undone. The days that followed felt longer than usual, even though the clocks moved at the same pace. The palace continued its routines, but each routine now carried an extra layer of care. People watched what they said, they watched how they stood, they watched how they addressed one another. Small details mattered more than ever. The guard noticed everything. He noticed how Princess Charlotte's name was spoken less often in group conversations. When it was mentioned, voices softened and sentences ended quickly, as if no one wanted to stay on the topic too long. He noticed how schedules were adjusted again and again, sometimes changing twice in a single day. He noticed how certain doors remained closed that had once been open. Most of all, he noticed the princess herself. She continued her lessons with focus and discipline. She listened carefully, followed instructions, and completed her work without complaint. To anyone observing casually, she appeared unchanged. Calm, polite, composed, but the guard saw the small differences. She spoke less during walks through the palace. Where she once asked thoughtful questions about history or architecture, she now listened quietly. When she smiled, it came more slowly. When she laughed, it sounded careful, as if she was checking whether it was allowed. One morning, as she passed the guard's post with an attendant, she hesitated. It was only for a second, but the guard saw it clearly. Her steps slowed. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. She looked ahead, then down, then forward again. She did not stop. She did not speak. But that moment stayed with the guard long after she had gone. The guard had been trained to observe without judgment. His role was not to interpret emotions or assign meaning. And yet, after years of service, he understood people well. He understood when someone felt uncertain, when someone felt watched, and when someone felt quietly set apart. Princess Charlotte was beginning to feel all three. Inside the palace, staff adjusted quickly, as they always did. New guidelines were followed with precision. Changes in address were applied without hesitation. Those who made mistakes corrected themselves instantly, offering polite apologies and moving on. No one openly discussed how strange it felt. The guard overheard fragments of conversations during his shifts. A housekeeper murmuring about how quickly things changed. An assistant wondering aloud if this would truly remain temporary. A senior staff member reminding a junior one that their role was to follow, not to question. Each voice carried its own tension, even when words were careful. One afternoon, the guard was stationed near a small sitting room that Princess Charlotte sometimes used for quiet study. The door was slightly open, and he could hear voices inside. The princess was speaking with a trusted tutor, someone who had been with her for years. "Did I do something wrong?" the princess asked softly. There was a pause before the tutor answered. "No," the tutor said gently. "This isn't about something you did." The princess was quiet for a moment. "Then why does it feel like something was taken away?" she asked. The guard felt a tightening in his chest. He stood perfectly still, but every word reached him clearly. The tutor took another pause, longer this time. "Sometimes," the tutor said carefully, "decisions are made that don't always feel fair, even when people believe they are doing the right thing." The princess did not respond right away. When she did, her voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it. "I'll try to understand," she said. The guard had witnessed many serious conversations in his career, but hearing those words spoken so quietly affected him deeply. There was no anger in the princess's voice, no protest, only acceptance shaped by confusion. That evening, the guard stood watch during a formal dinner. The event was elegant, controlled, and carefully planned. Guests spoke warmly, unaware of the undercurrent moving beneath the polished surface. Princess Charlotte attended briefly, seated among others. She followed every rule she had been taught. She waited her turn to speak. She listened attentively. She smiled when addressed, but the guard noticed something else. When introductions were made, the wording shifted slightly. It was subtle, but it mattered. The princess noticed too. He could see it in the way her eyes flickered for just a moment before she recovered. No one corrected the wording. The guard understood then that this was not just a procedural change. It was a lived experience, unfolding day by day, shaping how the princess saw herself and how others saw her. Later that night, as the palace grew quiet again, the guard found himself reflecting on his oath more deeply than ever before. He had sworn to protect the crown, to maintain order, and to uphold tradition. He had always believed those goals aligned with fairness and care. Now he was not so sure. He did not blame the officials who made the decision. He knew the pressure they faced. He knew the weight of public opinion and long-term planning. He had seen institutions bend to survive before, but he also knew that survival often came with a cost. The guard began to notice how the princess was gradually being removed from certain moments. She was no longer present at small planning meetings that involved the younger members of the family. She no longer joined certain informal gatherings. Her world was shrinking, even as she grew older. One afternoon, she passed through the corridor alone again, something that had become rare. She stopped near the same window she had paused at days earlier. Outside, the garden was quiet, leaves moving gently in the breeze. She rested her hand against the glass, lost in thought. The guard stood nearby, still and silent. After a moment, she turned slightly, not fully facing him, but enough that her voice carried. "Is it always like this?" she asked softly. The guard did not move. He was not permitted to answer. He was not permitted to react. The silence stretched. She waited, then seemed to realize the impossibility of her question. She gave a small nod to herself and turned away, walking down the hall with measured steps. The guard remained frozen in place, but inside something shifted. He had dedicated his life to standing firm, to being unmovable. Yet now he felt the weight of that stillness pressing against him. He wondered what it meant to protect someone if you were never allowed to speak, never allowed to act, never allowed to acknowledge what you saw. That night he barely noticed the passing hours. His thoughts returned again and again to the same idea. Duty was meant to serve something greater. But what happened when duty required silence in the face of quiet harm? The next day brought another update to protocol. Another adjustment, another reminder that everything was proceeding as planned. Princess Charlotte continued to comply with grace. She adapted quickly, learning the new rules without complaint. She corrected herself when she slipped. She thanked those who guided her. The guard admired her strength, but it troubled him too. No one so young should have to be that strong. As the days went on, whispers reached beyond the palace walls, not details but questions. Why were appearances changing? Why was the schedule different? Why did certain traditions seem altered? Officials dismissed concerns politely. Statements were measured and reassuring. The narrative remained controlled. Inside, the guard felt the growing distance between words and reality. One evening, after a long shift, the guard stood alone in a quiet corridor. The lights were dim, the air still. He had stood in that same spot countless times, but it felt different now. For the first time in his career, he allowed himself to imagine a choice, not action. Not rebellion, just a choice. He did not know yet what that choice would be. He did not know how far he was willing to go, but the thought itself was new, and once formed, it could not be undone. Princess Charlotte passed by later that night, escorted to her rooms. She walked calmly, posture perfect, expression composed. As she moved past the guard, she slowed slightly and gave a small nod, barely noticeable. The guard did not return it, but inside he acknowledged it fully. As the corridor fell quiet once more, the guard stood at attention, just as he always had. Yet beneath the discipline, beneath the silence, his conscience was no longer still. Something was building, slow and steady, like a tide pulling against the shore. And the guard knew that eventually it would reach a point where standing still would no longer feel like enough. The moment arrived quietly, without warning, just like many important moments inside the palace. There was no announcement, no raised voices, no dramatic signal. It came as a simple request written on a small official note and delivered with careful politeness. The guard was asked to report to a senior office the following morning. He read the note once, then folded it neatly and placed it inside his uniform pocket. His face did not change. His posture remained steady. Anyone watching would have seen only another routine instruction being followed. Inside, however, his thoughts were already moving. That night, as he stood at his post, he reflected on everything that had led to this point. The quiet changes, the careful words, the silence that followed questions never answered. He thought of Princess Charlotte, her calm voice, her steady composure, and the way she had learned to accept uncertainty without protest. He wondered how many times in history similar moments had passed unnoticed, carried forward by people who chose comfort over conscience. By morning, the palace was awake earlier than usual. There was a sense of preparation in the air, not for a public event, but for something internal. Staff moved efficiently, avoiding unnecessary interaction. Conversations were brief and focused. The guard arrived at the office precisely on time. The room was formal but not grand. The walls were lined with books and framed documents. A large desk stood near the window, sunlight filtering in softly. Behind the desk sat a senior official the guard had known for years, a person who valued order and loyalty above all else. The official gestured for the guard to stand, not sit. That alone signaled the seriousness of the meeting. "Thank you for coming promptly," the official said calmly. "Of course," the guard replied. There was a pause. The official studied the guard for a moment, as if weighing something carefully. "You have served with distinction," the official began. "Your record is without fault. Your commitment has never been questioned." The guard listened, his expression neutral. "However," the official continued, "recent circumstances require reaffirmation of certain expectations." The guard understood what was coming. The official spoke about unity, about the importance of presenting a single, steady front, about how personal interpretation must never interfere with institutional direction. The words were calm, reasonable, and carefully chosen. Finally, the official said, "We need to be certain that all personnel remain fully aligned." There it was. The guard took a slow breath. "With respect," he said evenly, "I have always followed protocol." "Yes," the official replied, nodding, "but alignment is more than action, it is understanding." The room fell quiet. The guard had prepared for this moment, though he had never truly expected it to arrive. He thought of his oath. He thought of his years of service. He thought of standing silent while a child tried to understand something no child should have to carry alone. He straightened slightly. "I understand my duty," he said, "but I also understand the weight of silence." The official's expression tightened just a fraction. "This is not the time for personal reflection," the official said. "The institution must come first." The guard nodded slowly. "That is exactly why I am here," he replied. He reached into his uniform pocket and placed a neatly folded document on the desk. The official looked down at it, then back up. "What is this?" the official asked, though the answer was already clear. "My resignation," the guard said simply. The room seemed to hold its breath. The officials stared at the document, disbelief flickering across their face. "This is unnecessary," they said. "No one is asking you to leave." "No," the guard replied calmly, "but I am being asked to stand in a way I no longer can." The official leaned back slightly. "You are making a serious mistake. Your career, your reputation." "I am aware," the guard said. "You have served too long to throw it away now." "I have served too long not to understand why this matters," the guard replied. There was a long silence. Finally, the official spoke again, more quietly. "Once this is done, it cannot be undone." The guard nodded. "I understand." The document was accepted. The meeting ended without anger, without raised voices. It ended the way many palace decisions did, with quiet finality. When the guard stepped back into the corridor, the palace looked the same as it always had. The walls were unchanged. The light fell just as it had every morning. Yet to him, everything felt different. Word of the resignation moved quickly, though discreetly. It was not announced publicly. It did not need to be. Within the palace, everyone noticed. Staff members exchanged brief looks. Some appeared surprised, others seemed quietly thoughtful. A few nodded subtly when they passed him, gestures so small they could be denied if questioned. The guard continued his duties for the remainder of the day, as protocol required. He stood at his post, followed instructions, and maintained the same discipline he always had. Nothing in his behavior suggested this was his final day. Princess Charlotte was not informed directly. She continued her routine, unaware of the decision that had been made. In the afternoon, she passed through the corridor with an attendant. As she drew near, she slowed, as if sensing something was different. She glanced at the guard, her eyes searching his face. He remained still, eyes forward. She hesitated, then moved on. That brief moment cut deeper than he expected. As evening approached, the guard was called once more, this time to finalize departure arrangements. His uniform would be returned. His access credentials would be surrendered. His exit would be quiet, respectful, and orderly. He agreed to everything without objection. Before his final shift ended, he was granted a few moments alone in the corridor where he had spent so many hours. The lights were dimmer now, the palace settling into night. He stood there listening to the familiar sounds, distant footsteps, soft echoes. The gentle hum of a place built on tradition. He thought of all he had protected, all he had witnessed, all he had chosen not to say. Princess Charlotte passed by one last time that evening, escorted by a senior attendant. She walked with the same composed grace she had learned so young. As she drew level with the guard, she stopped. The attendant paused, surprised. The princess looked up at the guard. Her voice was soft but steady. "Thank you," she said. No explanation followed, none was needed. The guard did not move. He did not speak, but his eyes softened just enough to acknowledge the moment. She nodded once, then continued down the corridor. When she disappeared from view, the guard felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The decision he had made no longer felt heavy. It felt right. Later that night, he removed his uniform carefully, folding it with the same precision he had always used. Each piece was placed neatly, treated with respect. It had been more than clothing. It had been a symbol of his life's work. He left the palace without ceremony. No cameras waited, no crowd gathered. The gates closed behind him with a soft sound that echoed briefly, then faded. As he walked away, he did not look back. Inside the palace, routines continued. Decisions moved forward. Silence returned to its place, but something had changed. A guard had chosen conscience over comfort. And though his absence might never be officially acknowledged, its impact would linger, quietly reminding those who remained that even in the most structured institutions, integrity still had a voice. The guard stepped into the night, his path uncertain, but his resolve clear. For the first time in many years, he was no longer standing still. Morning came without ceremony. The city beyond the palace walls woke to its usual rhythm, cars moving through streets, people heading to work, shops opening their doors. Life continued, unaware that something quiet but meaningful had already taken place. The former guard woke early, just as he always had. His body still followed the discipline of years, even though the uniform was no longer waiting for him. For a brief moment, he reached instinctively for it, then paused. The habit faded, replaced by a calm acceptance. He dressed simply and stood by the window of his small room, watching the light rise over rooftops instead of palace towers. The view was different, but the quiet felt familiar. He breathed deeply, feeling a sense of freedom he had not expected to feel so soon. Inside the palace, the day followed its structured course. Staff arrived on time, schedules were reviewed, instructions were delivered. To many, the guard's absence felt strange, like a missing note in a well-known tune. No one spoke of it openly, but people noticed. Princess Charlotte noticed too. She asked about him during breakfast, her voice polite and calm. "Is the guard who stood near the east corridor still assigned there?" she asked. The attendant paused, then answered gently. "He has moved on to other duties." The princess nodded, accepting the explanation, but she felt the space he had left behind. He had been a quiet presence, steady and familiar. His silence had carried a kind of safety she hadn't known how to name until it was gone. She continued her day as instructed. Lessons, reading practice. She followed every rule as she always did. But something inside her had changed. She had seen someone make a choice even if she did not fully understand it yet. As days passed, whispers beyond the palace walls began to grow, nothing specific, just questions. Observers noticed changes in appearances, in schedules, in tradition. Commentators spoke carefully, using respectful language. Officials responded with calm reassurance. The narrative remained controlled. Inside the palace, however, a subtle shift had occurred. Staff members moved with the same professionalism, but some carried a new awareness. The resignation had reminded them that service was not only about obedience, it was also about values. No one spoke this thought aloud. The former guard spent his days adjusting to life beyond palace walls. He walked through public parks without escort. He stood in lines without being noticed. At first, the quiet anonymity felt strange, but gradually it felt grounding. He read newspapers at a small cafe each morning. He listened to conversations around him. People spoke freely, argued kindly, laughed openly. It reminded him of a world he had protected from a distance but rarely touched. Occasionally, he saw mentions of the royal family in the news. Carefully written pieces, measured analysis, nothing dramatic. He read them without bitterness. He did not regret his decision. One afternoon, he received a letter. It was simple, without official markings. The handwriting was careful, familiar. It was from a former colleague. The letter did not discuss details. It did not mention decisions or consequences. It simply said that his choice had been noticed and that it had made some people think more deeply about their own roles. The guard folded the letter and placed it beside others he had kept over the years. Letters from family, from old friends, from moments that mattered. Inside the palace, Princess Charlotte continued to grow. She adapted as she always had. She learned new expectations. She followed updated guidance. She asked fewer questions aloud but thought deeply. She remembered the guard who had never spoken yet had somehow listened. As time passed, she began to understand that power was not always loud and strength was not always visible. Sometimes it was found in quiet choices made when no one was watching. One evening, she stood by the same window where she had once paused in confusion. The garden outside looked peaceful. She rested her hand against the glass and breathed slowly. She did not feel angry. She felt thoughtful. The palace remained strong. Traditions continued. Adjustments settled into routine. To the world, nothing appeared broken, but within the walls, a small change lingered. People spoke a little more carefully around children. Some staff members took extra time to explain changes instead of dismissing questions. These were not orders. They were choices. The former guard found work that suited him, not ceremonial, not prestigious. Honest work that allowed him to help people directly. He liked the simplicity of it. Each day had clear purpose. Sometimes he was asked about his past. He shared only what felt right. He did not speak of conflict or disagreement. He spoke of service, responsibility, and learning when to listen to oneself. At night, he slept peacefully. Months passed. Princess Charlotte appeared at a public event once again. She stood with confidence, greeted warmly, and carried herself with grace. Cameras captured her composure. Commentators praised her maturity. No one mentioned the past changes anymore, but the princess remembered. As she left the event, she glanced briefly toward the security line. A new guard stood where the old one once had. The posture was correct, the discipline flawless. She smiled politely and moved on. Yet in her heart, she carried a quiet lesson that would stay with her for years. The former guard watched the event later on a screen in a shop window. He recognized her immediately. He noticed how she held herself, steady and calm. He nodded to himself. The story did not end with his departure. It continued through the lives it had touched, through the thoughts it had planted. He understood now that loyalty was not about standing forever. Sometimes it was about knowing when to step away so others could see more clearly. As evening settled, he walked home through streets lit by soft lamps. The world felt wide, uncertain, and honest. He had no title, no uniform, no official role. But he carried something far more lasting: integrity. And somewhere behind palace walls, a young girl continued to grow, shaped not only by tradition, but by the quiet example of someone who had chosen conscience when silence would have been easier. The night moved on, calm and steady, holding within it the truth that real change often begins not with noise, but with one quiet step in a new direction.